The Galactic Empire had been conquering planets for centuries. They were strong, powerful, and feared across the galaxy. The Empire had crushed countless civilizations, leaving no one to challenge their authority. They believed they were unbeatable. Their fleet was the largest and most advanced in the galaxy, filled with enormous warships, powerful weapons, and skilled soldiers. Every time they set their sights on a new planet, they knew it would be an easy victory. No one had ever been able to stand up to them. But then, they looked at Earth. The Empire knew little about this small blue planet in a distant corner of the galaxy. They had scanned it from afar and seen that it was full of life, but they thought the humans were just like any other species, weak and easily controlled. They had no idea what they were about to face. The decision was made. Earth would be the Empire's next target. The Emperor ordered his fleet to begin preparations for the invasion. No one in the Empire had ever even heard of Earth's military or its people. It seemed like just another simple conquest. Earth would be no different from the many other worlds the Empire had taken over. The humans would bow before the Empire, just like everyone else. The Emperor was confident. He had no doubt that his fleet would crush the humans in a matter of hours. The Empire's leaders laughed at the idea of fighting a species that was so far behind them technologically. They couldn't imagine how anyone could survive against their overwhelming strength. As the Empire's fleet began its journey toward Earth, the humans on the planet had no idea what was coming. The Empire had chosen to invade quietly, without warning. The humans were completely unaware that their world was about to be torn apart. But there was something strange. The moment the fleet entered Earth's solar system, a message was sent out. It wasn't a message from the humans' governments or military leaders, but from someone, or something, that seemed to speak directly to the Empire's commanders. The message was simple, short, direct. Run. The Empire's leaders were puzzled. They couldn't understand why the humans would send such a message. It made no sense. Why would a species, so clearly outmatched, warn them like that? The message wasn't threatening or full of anger. It wasn't a call for help. It was just one word. Run. The commanders on the Empire's ships laughed. "This is ridiculous," one of them said. "Do they really think a single message will stop us? We are the Empire. Nothing can stop us." The fleet moved closer to Earth, but the message kept repeating. It wasn't just a random broadcast. It was being sent from every corner of the planet, in every language the humans spoke. Run. It echoed in the emptiness of space, reaching every ship in the Empire's fleet. The Empire's commanders began to feel a little uneasy, but they quickly dismissed the warning. "It's just a trick," one said. "A desperate attempt by the humans to scare us. They're afraid." The fleet continued toward Earth, undeterred. The Empire's ships were massive, their weapons far more powerful than anything Earth had. The humans wouldn't even know what hit them. They would fight for a little while, but the Empire knew it was only a matter of time before they gave up and surrendered. But the message was there, still repeating, still hanging in the air. Run. As the Empire's fleet entered Earth's atmosphere, the humans on the ground were already ready. They had seen the signs, felt the tension. Earth's leaders had been aware of the Empire for some time, though they had never encountered them. But the warning from their mysterious source had been clear. The humans weren't afraid. They knew something the Empire didn't. The Empire's commanders thought it was just a game. They thought Earth would fall like all the others. But they had made a terrible mistake. The humans were not what they seemed. The first ships began to drop from the Empire's fleet, and their soldiers prepared to land on Earth's surface. They were ready for easy victory. But as they looked down at the planet, something began to feel different. The humans weren't fleeing. They weren't running. Instead, they were preparing. The Galactic Empire, the most powerful force in the galaxy, had never met a species like humans. They didn't understand the one thing that made them so dangerous. They had underestimated Earth, and soon they would find out how wrong they were. The humans weren't going to run. but they would make the Empire wish they had. The Galactic Empire was used to winning. It had been thousands of years since they had met any serious resistance. No one had ever dared challenge their power, and they had grown arrogant. Their ships were the biggest and most advanced. Their weapons could destroy planets, and their soldiers were fierce. The Empire was the law of the galaxy. No one stood a chance against them. But now, as the fleet approached Earth, something strange happened. A single, short message kept repeating across the Empire's ships. Run. It was strange, confusing, and in the eyes of the Empire, meaningless. Why would a weak, helpless species send a message like that? The Empire's commanders laughed at the message. They thought it was a joke. Surely, no one could be serious about challenging the might of the Galactic Empire. It's just a scare tactic, one of the commanders said. The humans are trying to make us afraid. They think their message will stop us. How foolish. The officers around him agreed. They believed that Earth was just like every other planet they had conquered. The humans were primitive. They had no advanced technology, no real weapons, and no way of stopping the Empire's ships. The idea that the humans were capable of anything more than running away was laughable. The fleet continued its course, moving closer to Earth with no hesitation. The Empire's massive warships moved through space like an unstoppable storm, their guns locked and ready. They were about to crush Earth beneath their heel, just like they had done to countless worlds before. Yet that message kept coming. Run. It echoed in the silent space around them, almost like a warning. The commanders felt a flicker of doubt, but they quickly pushed it away. They were used to enemies that tried to scare them. They had dealt with threats before, and every time, they had destroyed them. Why are we even paying attention to this? One officer asked. We're the Empire. No one can stop us. Let's just end this quickly. They all agreed, and the fleet moved forward, their weapons ready to fire. But still, the message continued. Run. As the ships entered Earth's orbit, the commanders noticed something odd. Earth's surface was quiet, too quiet. There were no large defenses waiting to stop them. There were no signs of a large military presence, no fleets of warships lined up to face them. It seemed like the humans had done nothing to prepare. They really are afraid, one of the commanders muttered. They've given up. We'll wipe them out in minutes. But the humans had done something different. They hadn't panicked. They hadn't run away. Instead, they had prepared in their own way. They weren't afraid, and they weren't going to give up. They had simply waited for the right moment. The Empire's fleet began to move down into Earth's atmosphere, the first ships ready to deploy soldiers. The Empire's troops felt ready. They were prepared for a quick, easy victory. They imagined Earth's people would surrender without a fight, begging for mercy. But as the first drop pods began to fall toward the Earth's surface, they saw something they didn't expect. Small human fighters, ships that seemed old and outdated, began to rise into the air. They were nothing compared to the might of the Empire's fleet, but they were well organized, moving quickly and attacking with precision. The Empire's soldiers were surprised. They hadn't expected a fight from such small old ships. The humans had no chance against the Empire's superior technology. But as the battle began, the Empire quickly realized that the humans weren't going to back down. Their fighters were fast and unpredictable, dodging the Empire's massive warships, attacking from unexpected angles. It wasn't a fight the Empire had ever imagined. The humans weren't afraid. They weren't running. Instead, they were fighting with everything they had. One of the commanders started to feel uneasy. He had underestimated the humans. The Empire's fleet was huge and powerful, but now they were facing an enemy that refused to give up. He could see the shock on his soldiers' faces as they tried to fight back against the sudden, fierce resistance from the humans. The Empire had believed that Earth would be easy to conquer, but it was clear now that the humans were not like other civilizations. They weren't just going to bow down and surrender. The more the Empire fought, the more they began to realize they were facing something different. They were facing something dangerous. As the first wave of Empire soldiers landed on Earth, they were met with fierce resistance. The humans weren't just defending, they were attacking. Small groups of soldiers with weapons they had built themselves fought back against the Empire's soldiers with surprising skill. The Empire's advanced technology couldn't easily crush the humans' resourcefulness. And that message still rang in the Empire's ears. Run. It wasn't a warning to ignore. The humans were not afraid. The message wasn't a threat. It was the truth. And the Empire was starting to understand that. They were wrong. They had underestimated Earth. And now, it was too late. The Empire had underestimated Earth. They thought the humans would be easy to crush. The first wave of Empire soldiers landed on Earth's surface, and their commanders were sure it would be a quick victory. But they didn't realize that the humans had prepared for this moment. The Empire was about to learn the hard way that Earth was not a planet to be taken lightly. When the Empire's ships began to deploy their soldiers, they expected the humans to run in fear, to surrender without a fight. Instead, they were met with a different kind of resistance, unexpected, quick, and fierce. As the Empire's soldiers set foot on the ground, they found themselves facing small, human-made weapons that shouldn't have been able to stand up against their superior technology. But these weapons weren't normal. They were carefully designed by the humans, built for speed, precision, and strength. The Empire's soldiers, heavily armored and well-trained, found themselves in battle with a species they thought was weak. The humans fought back using guerrilla tactics, attacking in small groups, using the environment to their advantage. They hid in forests, behind buildings, and even underground, making it almost impossible for the Empire's forces to track them down. The Empire's soldiers tried to use their advanced technology to gain the upper hand. They fired lasers and launched missiles, but the humans were always one step ahead. Their weapons were simple but effective. They used clever traps, explosives, and even homemade firearms to damage the Empire's soldiers and equipment. The humans knew their land better than the Empire's soldiers could ever imagine, and they used that knowledge to create a battlefield that favored them. As the battle raged on, the Empire's commanders began to realize something they hadn't expected. The humans weren't running. They weren't hiding in fear. They were fighting back with everything they had, and they were doing it well. The Empire's soldiers began to lose ground. They had expected an easy victory, but instead, they found themselves struggling to control the situation. One of the commanders, watching from the safety of a command ship in orbit, frowned. How are they holding up so well? These humans should be crushed by now. What's going on? Another officer shook his head, disbelief on his face. I don't know, sir. They're everywhere, and their attacks are unpredictable. We can't pin them down. It's like they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The Empire's ships in orbit tried to support the ground forces, but it wasn't enough. The humans had a secret weapon, their spirit. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their homes, for their families, for their planet. The Empire's soldiers had never encountered such determination. They were used to easy victories, to worlds that crumbled before their might. But Earth wasn't like that. The humans had also prepared their air force. Small, fast fighter jets took to the sky, darting between the Empire's massive warships. The humans' jets weren't as advanced as the Empire's, but they were fast, agile, and full of surprises. They used hit-and-run tactics, attacking the Empire's ships from angles the larger, slower vessels couldn't defend against. The Empire's warships tried to retaliate, firing their powerful weapons, but the humans were too quick. Every time they fired, the humans were already gone, leaving only destruction in their wake. The Empire's commanders grew increasingly frustrated. They had underestimated the humans in every way. They thought it would be a simple invasion, but now they were faced with a war. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were winning small battles, one after another. The Empire's soldiers were getting tired. Their morale was slipping. They had expected to crush the humans, but instead, they were the ones on the defensive. In the middle of the chaos, a human commander stood on the front lines, watching as his troops fought with everything they had. He could see the Empire's soldiers beginning to falter. They were losing their confidence. The human commander raised his hand, signaling for a new offensive. The humans launched their next wave of attacks. They hit the Empire's forces harder, faster, and more strategically. The Empire's soldiers, exhausted from the constant fighting, couldn't keep up. Some of them began to retreat, unsure of how to continue the fight. The humans, sensing the weakness, pressed forward. The battle was far from over, but the first signs of victory were beginning to show. The humans were no longer just defending. They were fighting back, pushing the Empire's soldiers back. The Empire's commanders, watching from above, could see their forces beginning to lose control. They were stunned. This wasn't the Earth they had expected. This wasn't a planet that would bend to their will. The humans were different. As the first day of the battle ended, the Empire's soldiers were forced to pull back. They had not won the victory they had imagined. They had been defeated on the ground by a species they thought was weak. And above all, they had learned a harsh truth. The humans weren't afraid. They weren't going to run. They were going to fight. And they were going to win. The Empire had never faced anything like this before. They were used to quick, easy victories. Every time they invaded a new world, it was the same story. The inhabitants would surrender, beg for mercy, or simply give up without a fight. But Earth was different. The humans were not afraid. They were not running. They were fighting back. And now, the Empire was starting to realize just how wrong they had been. After the first day of battle, the Empire's soldiers were already feeling the pressure. Their forces had been pushed back, and they had lost ground they expected to easily take. The humans weren't just defending their planet. They were fighting with everything they had, and they were winning. Slowly, the Empire's confidence began to crack. The Empire's fleet, which had once seemed so powerful and unstoppable, was now facing problems they hadn't planned for. The Empire's warships, massive and heavily armed, had begun to take damage. The human jets and fighters, although smaller and less advanced, were incredibly fast and hard to catch. They struck with precision and then disappeared into the sky, leaving the Empire's ships with damaged weapons and shattered shields. The humans had learned how to fight back, how to use their planet's resources to their advantage. One of the Empire's commanders, General Vokar, was watching the battle unfold from the safety of his flagship. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself. "The humans should be cowering in fear. Why are they still fighting? Why aren't they giving up?" He had never seen anything like this before. He had fought countless wars, conquered countless worlds, but Earth had proven to be different. The humans weren't like the weak species the Empire had encountered before. They were fighting with everything they had, and they weren't going to stop. The human fighters were everywhere. They attacked in groups, launching hit-and-run missions that kept the Empire's forces constantly on edge. Their tactics were unpredictable, and no matter how hard the Empire tried to catch them, the humans always found a way to slip away. Every time the Empire thought they had the upper hand, the humans would strike again, harder and faster. General Vokar paced nervously on the bridge of his ship. He had called for reinforcements, but the more he looked at the battlefield, the more he realized that reinforcements might not be enough. The humans weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat, and he had underestimated them. "Send a message to the High Command," he ordered. "Tell them we need more troops. We need more ships. Earth is not like the other planets we've conquered. These humans are different." As the message was sent to the Empire's central command, Vokar turned to his officers. "We need to regroup and rethink our strategy. We're losing too many ships, too many soldiers. The humans have caught us off guard." His officers nodded, but they too could see that the Empire's grip on Earth was slipping. They had expected an easy invasion, but now they were stuck in a battle they weren't prepared for, and the more they fought, the more they realized they had no idea what the humans were capable of. Meanwhile, on the ground, the humans were not giving up. They were everywhere, moving quickly through the cities, forests, and mountains. The Empire's soldiers were beginning to feel trapped. Every time they moved, the humans attacked. Every time they tried to find a way to retreat, they found themselves in another fight. One human commander, a young woman named Captain Lena, stood in front of her troops, giving orders with calm determination. "We've got them on the run. Keep up the pressure. They're not used to this kind of fight. Let's show them what we can do." Her troops, a mix of soldiers, engineers, and civilians who had taken up arms, cheered in response. They knew this wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about winning their home, their future. The Empire had come to Earth thinking it was an easy target, but now the humans were showing them just how wrong they were. The Empire's soldiers, once confident in their strength, were now starting to feel the effects of the humans' resistance. They were running low on supplies. Their morale was breaking. The Empire's superior technology wasn't helping them anymore. The humans had fought through wars, endured hardship, and now they were using that experience to fight back with everything they had. Back in orbit, General Volker looked at the battlefield and clenched his fists. The situation was getting worse by the hour. The Empire's soldiers had not expected this kind of fight. They had expected Earth to fall in days, not weeks. The humans were making it clear that they would never surrender, that they would never give up. "They're not like any species we faced," Volker said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "They don't fear us. They fight for something greater." It was a truth the Empire had never known before. The humans weren't just defending their planet. They were defending their way of life, their families, their homes, and the Empire was realizing, too late, that it had made a grave mistake. The Empire's fleet, once full of pride and arrogance, was now in retreat. The humans had proven that no matter how powerful the enemy, no matter how advanced their technology, the spirit of a people fighting for their survival could never be underestimated. The Empire was starting to learn the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate the will of humans to fight back. The fear that began to spread among the Empire's soldiers was something they had never felt before. They were the most powerful army in the galaxy, and for the first time, they were up against an enemy that wasn't afraid of them. They had been trained to believe that their technology, their weapons, and their strength made them unstoppable. But the humans had shown them a different reality. It all started with small things: whispers in the barracks, nervous glances between soldiers. As the battle raged on, the Empire's forces were starting to lose more than just ground. They were losing their confidence. They were losing their will to fight. The humans weren't backing down, and the soldiers didn't know how to handle it. The Empire's soldiers had never been in a situation like this. In every battle they fought, they were always the victors. The enemy always crumbled before their might. But the humans had no intention of crumbling. They fought back with such fury and determination that it shook the soldiers to their core. It was as if the humans didn't know how to be afraid. And that was terrifying. Sergeant Solar, a battle-hardened officer who had led countless invasions across the galaxy, stood at the front of his unit, staring out into the dense forest where the humans were hiding. His men were tense, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The last time they had attacked, the humans had ambushed them. Now, Zillar couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched again. "Keep your eyes open," Zillar growled, his voice low and filled with unease. "The humans are close. I can feel it." His soldiers, once proud and confident, shifted uncomfortably. They were used to being the ones doing the hunting, not the hunted. But every time they moved, every time they tried to advance, it felt like the humans were always one step ahead. The soldiers had been caught in traps, ambushed in the night, and forced to retreat. They had never imagined they would be the ones on the defensive. The fear started to grow. It wasn't just the enemy that terrified them. It was the unknown. The humans didn't follow any rules. They didn't act like normal enemies. There were no clear patterns, no easy way to predict what they would do next. They used their environment, their terrain, and their weapons in ways the Empire had never expected. It made the soldiers feel like they were fighting ghosts, an enemy they could never quite see, never quite catch. In the Empire's command ship, General Volker was beginning to show signs of frustration. His soldiers were reporting more casualties. The reinforcements he had called for were slow to arrive. The once confident officers now spoke in worried tones, unsure of how to proceed. The battle wasn't going as planned, and the fear was starting to spread to the top. Why are they so stubborn? Volker muttered to himself. Why aren't they retreating? Why aren't they giving up? He had underestimated the humans. He had expected them to be like all the other species he had conquered, weak, easy to break. But these humans were different. They fought like they had nothing to lose, like they had a purpose that was far greater than just winning a battle. They were willing to die for their planet, and that scared the Empire. Back on the ground, the Empire's soldiers were beginning to show cracks in their armor, both literal and emotional. A private named Kell, who had seen many battles, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the humans, men, women, and children, fighting back with a ferocity he had never seen before. He sat up in his tent one night, staring into the darkness, the sounds of distant gunfire echoing in his ears. How are they doing this? He whispered to himself. Why won't they give up? The fear was growing. It wasn't just about losing the battle. It was about losing to an enemy that wasn't supposed to be a threat. The Empire's soldiers had never known fear like this. It was a fear that came from realizing that they weren't as invincible as they had believed. The humans weren't just defending their world. They were fighting to survive, to protect everything they loved. And that kind of fight was terrifying. As the days wore on, the Empire's soldiers began to retreat further and further. They no longer had the confidence they once had. They were tired, scared, and starting to question their mission. They had thought the humans would be easy to crush, but now they weren't sure how they were going to win this war. General Volker was forced to call for a temporary retreat, hoping that a break would give his soldiers time to regroup and rebuild their strength. He had to admit, though, that the longer they stayed on Earth, the more the humans began to break their spirits. What are we up against? He said aloud, almost to himself. These humans, they don't fear us. They never feared us. He had been wrong. He had thought the humans would bend to the Empire's will. But instead, the humans were showing the Empire something it had never seen before, true strength. And that strength was enough to make even the bravest soldiers doubt their mission. The Empire's soldiers had never known fear before, but now, as they looked into the eyes of their human enemies, they realized they had been wrong all along. The humans were not just a species to be conquered. They were a species that would never back down. And that, more than anything, was terrifying. The Empire had thought they could control Earth. They had thought they could crush the humans in a matter of days. But now, things were different. The humans, once pushed back and underestimated, were no longer just defending their planet. They were taking the lead, and the Empire wasn't prepared for it. It began with small victories. Human soldiers, using the knowledge of their land, began to reclaim the cities they had lost. The Empire's warships, once the mighty force that ruled the sky, were now under constant attack. Human fighters, faster and more agile, swooped in and out of the Empire's defenses, firing from angles the Empire couldn't predict. The once feared Empire fleet had now become the hunted. General Volker sat in his command center, his face tense with frustration. He had expected reinforcements, but they were still on their way. His troops were spread thin, and now he was starting to see reports of humans taking back ground they had once controlled. How did this happen? He asked, more to himself than to anyone in particular. Why are we losing? His officers had no answer. They were all in shock. The humans were everywhere, and they were pushing back harder than ever. It wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines. They were seeing the civilian population rise up too. People who had once cowered in fear now picked up arms. They fought alongside their soldiers, defending their homes, their families, their very way of life. And that made them stronger than anything the Empire had faced before. One of the most surprising things was the way the humans had adapted. They didn't have the advanced technology the Empire's forces did, but they had something more: resourcefulness. They used everything around them. Abandoned factories became makeshift weapon factories. Streets became battlefields where the Empire's advanced tanks were vulnerable to well-placed traps. Humans used the cities they knew so well to their advantage. The Empire had never seen anything like it. In one key battle, the humans managed to strike at an Empire supply convoy, cutting off their resources and leaving them stranded. The convoy had been carrying essential equipment, including extra ammunition and fuel for the Empire's warships. Without it, the Empire's forces began to struggle. The humans, using their knowledge of the terrain, launched a series of lightning-fast attacks that caught the Empire's soldiers off guard. What had been a simple supply run turned into a disaster for the Empire. Lieutenant Reyna, a human officer, watched the convoy go up in flames from a nearby hill. She had led the strike herself, along with a group of highly trained soldiers. As the smoke rose into the sky, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. They had done it. The Empire's supplies were cut off. They had turned the tide in this area. "Great job, everyone," Reyna said, turning to her team. "Now, let's move. We've got more to do." She knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The humans had been pushed to their limits, but now they were fighting back with everything they had. Reyna's eyes were sharp with determination. "We're not going to stop until they leave." And she wasn't alone in her resolve. Across Earth, people were waking up to the reality that they had the power to fight back. People who had never picked up a weapon before were now standing side by side with experienced soldiers. Farmers, engineers, teachers, everyone had a role to play. The Empire had made a grave mistake by underestimating humanity. The humans weren't going to let their world fall without a fight. Back in the Empire's command center, Volker was receiving bad news from every direction. "What's happening on the ground?" he demanded. "Sir, the humans. They've begun a full counterattack," an officer replied, his voice shaking. "They've retaken several key cities, and our troops are being pushed back. We've lost control of the south. They've destroyed our supply lines." Volker slammed his fist on the table. "This can't be happening. The humans should have been crushed by now." But they hadn't been crushed. They were fighting back with everything they had. And now, the Empire was on the defensive. The humans weren't just playing a waiting game anymore. They were actively taking control of the situation. Across the planet, the humans were rallying. Even in the hardest-hit areas, there was hope. People were no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting to win. The Empire's forces were starting to retreat, regrouping to try and hold onto the territory they still controlled. They were now fighting for survival, just as much as the humans had been. The mighty Empire, which had once crushed worlds without a second thought, was now facing an enemy that refused to bow down. General Volker stared at the battle map in front of him, his mind racing. "We've underestimated them," he muttered. "These humans are more than we thought. And now, they've taken the lead." For the first time since the Empire's invasion of Earth had begun, Volker realized something he hadn't before. The humans weren't fighting just for their planet. They were fighting for their very survival. They had a strength the Empire couldn't break. And that was something the Empire would have to reckon with, whether they were ready or not. The battle had raged on for weeks, but now, as the dust settled and the sun rose over the war-torn landscape, it became clear the Empire's invasion of Earth had failed. The humans had fought back with a strength the Empire never expected. And now, the tide had turned in their favor. The Empire's once mighty fleet was in retreat, and their soldiers were scattered, demoralized, and lost. General Volker stood at the command center, staring at the holographic map in front of him. The lines that once marked their control were now disappearing, replaced by the human flags rising over their cities. His face was hard, but his eyes showed the defeat that was settling in. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying the price. "What are we going to do?" one of his officers asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've lost everything. The fleet's retreating, and we can't hold the ground any longer." Volker turned away from the map and looked out the window, where the skies were filled with the human ships. The Empire's once proud warships, now battered and beaten, were drifting in space. The humans had not only defeated their forces on Earth, they had shown that they could fight in space as well. There was nowhere left to run. "They should have run," Volker muttered under his breath, his voice cold. "They should have listened to our warning." But the humans hadn't run. They hadn't backed down, and now they were going to make sure the Empire never forgot their mistake. Back on Earth, the humans were preparing for the final push. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about sending a message. The humans had fought for their planet, their homes, and their families. Now, they were going to ensure that the Empire knew exactly who had won this war. Sergeant Rhina, who had led so many of the human counterattacks, stood with her team, looking at the massive screen in front of her. It showed the final countdown, the last moments of the Empire's fleet. The humans had deployed their secret weapon, a massive satellite that had been hidden on Earth for years. This weapon, a combination of advanced technology and human ingenuity, would send a signal to the Empire's remaining forces, one that would be heard across the galaxy. Rhina took a deep breath, knowing that once the message was sent, there would be no going back. This would be the end of the Empire's dreams of conquering Earth. It was time to send the message. You should have run. As the countdown began, Rhina looked around at her team. They had fought together, pulled together, and now they were about to finish what they had started. They had defeated the Empire not just with weapons, but with willpower. The Empire had underestimated them, and that would be their downfall. "Ready, Sergeant," a soldier said, his finger hovering over the button. "On your mark." Rhina nodded. "Do it." The soldier pressed the button, and a powerful signal burst from the satellite, sending waves of energy across space. The message was simple, but it would resonate in the hearts of the Empire's soldiers for the rest of their lives. You should have run. The signal was sent. Across the galaxy, the Empire's forces were listening. They had expected to hear the sounds of victory. Instead, they heard the voice of their defeat. The message came through loud and clear, carried on waves of energy that traveled faster than light. It was a warning, a statement, and a promise all in one. Back on the Empire's command ship, General Volker stared at his communication screen, his face pale. He had seen the message, and he knew it meant the end. The Empire had lost. The humans had proven that they were not just survivors. They were warriors, and they had taken back their world. Volker's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, but there was nothing left to do. The Empire was broken, their fleet in disarray. They had lost Earth, and they would never be able to recover from this defeat. The humans had made sure of that. The message echoed in his mind as he turned to his officers. "We have failed," he said, his voice hollow. "They should have run. We should have run." In the human-controlled cities, celebrations erupted. They had done it. Earth was theirs. The Empire had come, but they had not reckoned with the strength of humanity. The people of Earth were victorious, and the message was clear. They would never again be slaves to anyone, especially not the Empire. Rhina stood at the front of a crowd, watching the fireworks light up the sky. She had seen the worst of the war, and now she was witnessing the best. The humans had fought back, and now they had their world back. They should have run, Rhina whispered to herself, smiling as the last remnants of the Empire's forces flowed into space. But they didn't, and that was their mistake. The Empire had learned the hard way that humans would never give up. No matter how strong the enemy, no matter how overwhelming the odds, the people of Earth would always fight back. And in the end, they would always win. The stars above the destroyed planet twinkled like tiny lights in the sky. The planet, once full of life, was now nothing but ruins. The explosions had been so loud that the very ground had shaken, breaking cities and crushing homes. Among the wreckage, two alien brothers stood alone. Their names were Zor and Kiv. Their eyes were wide with fear and sadness. They had lost everything: family, friends, and home. They had no place left to go. Zor, the older brother, tried to stay strong, but his hands trembled. Kiv, the younger one, was barely holding back tears. The two of them had nowhere to turn. They could feel the cold wind blowing over the ashes of their planet, but it was the loneliness that hurt the most. The only family they had left was each other, and now they had to find a way to survive. Far away from the wreckage, a group of humans was scouting the galaxy. The humans were part of a military operation that often helped displaced aliens. They had seen the destruction from a distance and decided to investigate. They sent a ship to the ruined planet, hoping to find survivors and give them shelter. The human ship landed in the middle of the wreckage. The crew was ready to help anyone who needed it, but they did not expect what they found. Zor and Kiv, covered in dirt and looking lost, were the only survivors. They had no way of knowing what had happened or why their world was gone. But the humans, seeing the two frightened alien brothers, knew they couldn't leave them behind. Captain John, the leader of the human team, ordered the brothers to be brought aboard the ship. The brothers had no choice but to follow. As they stepped aboard, they were met by cold, unfamiliar faces. The humans didn't speak their language, and the brothers couldn't understand the humans either. But there was no other choice. Zor and Kiv sat in a corner of the ship, feeling the weight of their new reality. They were no longer on their home planet, but they didn't know where they were going. The humans were used to dealing with aliens from all over the galaxy. They were cold, professional, and efficient. But Captain John was different. He was known for being tough. Some said he was too harsh. He didn't like showing weakness, and he didn't believe in being soft with anyone. He expected his team to be strong and follow orders. And when it came to the two alien brothers, he didn't treat them any differently. Zor and Kiv tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easy. The ship was noisy, and every time they closed their eyes, they saw flashes of their home planet exploding. Kiv turned to Zor, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think they will hurt us?" he asked. Zor looked out the small window, his face sad. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we don't have a choice. We have to trust them." The brothers were taken to a small room where they could sleep. Captain John didn't offer any comfort. He gave them food and water, then left them alone. The brothers sat in the silence, still unsure of their new life. What would happen to them now? In the morning, they were brought to meet Captain John again. This time, the human was different. He was serious, almost cold. He spoke to them in a language they didn't understand, but his tone was clear. They needed to follow the rules. He showed them how to wear human clothes and how to clean themselves. Zor and Kiv didn't want to look weak, but everything felt strange. They had never seen anything like this before. Captain John's orders were simple, but they were hard to follow. The brothers didn't know how to survive in a world that wasn't theirs. They didn't know how to act, how to speak, or how to fit in. But Captain John didn't care. He wasn't going to go easy on them. He didn't offer kindness. He just made sure they understood that they had to be strong, or they would not survive. For the next few days, Captain John kept a close eye on the brothers. He showed them how to defend themselves, how to survive on a strange ship in the middle of space. Zor and Kiv struggled. They didn't understand the rules of the human world. Everything was different from what they had known, but they also knew that they had no other choice but to keep going. Captain John's tough exterior made Zor and Kiv feel even more alone. They'd missed their home, their family, and everything they had lost. But they didn't know if they would ever find those things again. For now, the only thing they could rely on was each other, and the tough human who had taken them in. The days passed slowly for Zor and Kiv aboard the human ship. The new world they found themselves in was nothing like their home planet. It was cold, metallic, and noisy. They were surrounded by strange humans who spoke in a language the brothers couldn't understand. But it was Captain John, their new guardian, who scared them the most. Captain John was the leader of the human crew, and everyone respected him. Fearfully so. He was a man of few words, and those words were usually commands. He walked through the halls of the ship with an air of confidence, his heavy boots echoing in the silent corridors. His face was always serious, his eyes hard and unreadable. The brothers had never met anyone like him before. He wasn't kind, nor did he show any warmth. His only focus seemed to be on making sure everything went according to his strict rules. Zor and Kiv quickly learned that Captain John's rules were not negotiable. They had to wake up early, even before the sun rose, and begin their training. At first, the brothers thought they would get a chance to rest or recover from the trauma of losing their home. But Captain John didn't give them that luxury. He pushed them hard, demanding their full attention and effort in everything they did. There was no time for sadness or weakness. "Get up now," Captain John would bark, his voice cutting through the silence. "We don't have time for excuses." Zor and Kiv were shocked by how harsh the captain was. He didn't speak kindly to them, and he certainly didn't try to comfort them. Instead, he ordered them to complete tasks that were far beyond what they thought they could do. They had to clean the ship, practice hand-to-hand combat, and even learn how to use human weapons. The brothers were not prepared for this kind of life. They were used to their peaceful home, where they didn't have to fight to survive. The first few days were the hardest. Zor, the older of the two, tried to keep his younger brother, Kiv, strong, but even he struggled with the demanding training. He had never been forced to work so hard in his life. Captain John didn't care about their pain. If they made a mistake, they had to do it all over again. There was no mercy. "Do it right or don't do it at all," Captain John would say, his tone cold and unforgiving. "Weakness doesn't belong on this ship." Zor and Kiv wanted to argue, to ask why they were being treated this way. But they knew better than to challenge the captain. They were in his world now, and he held all the power. They had no choice but to follow his orders. As the days turned into weeks, the brothers grew tired and frustrated. They had no time to mourn their lost family or their destroyed planet. All they could think about was surviving. Every day felt like a battle, and Captain John was their toughest opponent. One day, after a particularly grueling training session, Kiv couldn't take it anymore. His hands were bruised, and his body ached from the endless exercises. He fell to the floor, exhausted, and on the verge of tears. "I can't do this," Kiv whispered, his voice shaking. "It's too hard. We'll never be good enough for him." Zor knelt beside him, his own body aching just as much. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice low but steady. "Captain John is tough, but he's making us stronger. We can't give up." Kiv looked up at his older brother, his eyes filled with doubt. "But why does he have to be so mean? Why can't he show us kindness just once?" Zor sighed. He didn't have an answer. He didn't understand Captain John either, but he knew one thing: if they didn't learn from him, they would never survive. The world they were now in was harsh. It didn't care about their feelings or their past. It only cared about strength. The next day, as Captain John led them through another difficult task, Zor and Kiv pushed themselves harder than ever before. They weren't sure why Captain John treated them this way, but they started to see something behind his strictness. Every time they struggled, he was there, silently watching, making sure they didn't give up. He didn't show affection, but he was always there, pushing them to do their best. In the evenings, when the brothers sat alone in their small room, they would talk about Captain John. They didn't like his harshness, but they started to understand why he was the way he was. He was tough because life in the galaxy was tough. He had to be that way to survive. And maybe, just maybe, he was teaching them how to survive too. As time passed, Zor and Kiv slowly started to respect Captain John. They began to see that his tough love, as hard as it was helping them. They were becoming stronger, learning things they never thought possible. They were learning how to defend themselves, how to adapt to this new life. It wasn't easy, and they still missed their home, but they were beginning to understand that their new guardian wasn't their enemy. He was their guide in this harsh new world. Days turned into weeks, and Zor and Kiv began to adapt to their new life aboard the human ship. The harsh training, the strict rules, and Captain John's tough approach were becoming their new reality. But something strange began to happen. They started noticing things about Captain John they hadn't seen before. Beneath his tough exterior, there was a side to him they couldn't quite understand, a side they never expected. It happened one evening after a long day of training. The brothers were sitting together in their small room, their bodies sore from the daily exercises. Kiv was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, while Zor was cleaning his hands from the dirt that had built up during training. "I don't get it," Kiv muttered, his voice quiet. "Why does he care so much about us? He's never nice, never shows any kindness." Zor sighed, glancing over at his younger brother. "I don't know, but I think he's trying to make us stronger. Maybe that's his way of showing he cares." Kiv frowned, "But it doesn't feel like he cares. He's always so cold." Zor didn't know how to answer that. It was true. Captain John was cold. But as they talked, a strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe the captain wasn't just tough because of his job. Maybe there was something more to it. Something he hadn't seen yet. The next day, after another exhausting training session, Captain John gave them a rare break. He told them to meet him in the ship's common room, and both brothers were confused. It was unusual for Captain John to take any time off, let alone give them time to relax. But they followed his orders, unsure of what to expect. When they arrived, Captain John was already sitting at a table, his hands folded in front of him. For once, his usual stern expression had softened. It was the first time Zor and Kiv had ever seen him look human. He wasn't barking orders, and he wasn't demanding anything. He simply sat there, waiting for them. "Sit," Captain John said, his voice not harsh this time, but calm. Zor and Kiv exchanged a look before they hesitantly sat down across from him. Captain John studied them for a moment, his eyes looking deep into theirs. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," he said quietly. "I've pushed you hard because I know what this galaxy can be like, and I know what it takes to survive. But I also know it's not just about strength, it's about trust." Zor and Kiv were stunned. They had never heard Captain John speak like this before. His voice, usually so cold and commanding, was now soft, almost caring. "Trust," Kiv whispered. "You want us to trust you?" Captain John nodded slowly. "Yes, but trust is not something that happens overnight. You have to earn it. And I'm not asking for your trust just because I'm the captain. I'm asking for it because I want you to know that I will always have your back, no matter what." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the brothers couldn't speak. They had always seen Captain John as a hard, uncaring leader, but now he was showing them a side they had never expected. The side of a person who cared about their well-being, who wanted to help them, not just train them. Zor was the first to speak, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Why didn't you say this before? Why did you have to be so hard on us?" Captain John looked away for a moment, his eyes clouding over with something that looked like regret. "Because it's not easy to show weakness. I had to make you strong before you could understand what it really means to trust someone. The galaxy is full of dangers. I've seen too many people get hurt because they didn't understand that strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing who you can count on. Kiv shifted in his seat, his voice trembling slightly. But we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for any of it. Captain John's face softened. I know, and I'm sorry for that. But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. Sometimes we have to fight for what we want. And sometimes we have to trust people we don't understand. Zor looked down at his hands, his mind racing. Captain John's words felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Maybe he wasn't as cold and distant as he seemed. Maybe Captain John was just a man trying to survive in a world that demanded toughness. And maybe, just maybe, he cared more than he let on. "We'll try," Zor said quietly. "We'll try to trust you." Captain John nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of approval. "That's all I ask. But remember, you're not alone. You have each other. And now, you have me too." For the first time, Zor and Kiv felt a flicker of warmth in the captain's presence. It wasn't the warmth they had hoped for, but it was something. It was enough to give them hope that they could survive this strange new life they had been forced into. They still had a long way to go, but maybe they didn't have to face it alone. Zor and Kiv had been on the human ship for months now. They were no longer the scared, confused brothers who had arrived here. They had grown stronger, faster, and smarter under Captain John's tough training. But they still hadn't faced the one thing they were most afraid of: battle. They had heard rumors of humans fighting in wars, of the enemies they would face, and they weren't sure they were ready for any of it. But the day came when Captain John called them into the control room. His face was serious, his eyes hard, like they always were before a mission. "Get ready," he ordered. "We're heading into battle." Zor and Kiv exchanged worried glances. They had been trained for this moment, but now that it was real, their nerves were on edge. They had never fought a real battle, and they didn't know if they could handle the chaos, the noise, and the fear that would come with it. "We're here to survive," Captain John said, noticing their hesitation. "You've learned everything you need to. Trust in your training." The brothers nodded, trying to hide the fear in their hearts. They quickly suited up in the special human armor and rushed to their battle stations. The ship shook slightly as it entered enemy territory. The alarms blared, and the crew went into full battle mode. Everyone knew what to do, except for Zor and Kiv. They were still new to this world, and the reality of it hit them hard. Captain John stood at the front, barking orders to the crew. His voice was sharp, commanding. "Prepare for impact. Target the enemy ships. Do not hesitate." The brothers took their positions, trying to stay calm, but their hearts raced. The control room was filled with tension. Zor gripped the edge of his station, trying to steady his breathing. Kiv, beside him, was trembling slightly. He had never seen a real battle before, and he couldn't imagine what it would be like. He had always been taught to avoid conflict, not to seek it. The ship shuddered as the first enemy blasts hit, shaking the entire vessel. The battle had begun. "Fire back," Captain John shouted. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "Aim for their weak points." The brothers did what they had been trained to do. Zor quickly adjusted the targeting system, while Kiv fired the first round of shots. The sound of the ship's weapons firing filled the room, followed by the loud explosions outside. Zor and Kiv felt the power behind each shot, the force that sent them flying through space. It was nothing like the training. The real battle was loud, chaotic, and terrifying. The noise of weapons, the sounds of explosions, and the strange lights flashing outside the windows made everything feel overwhelming. Zor's heart raced, and his hand shook as he adjusted the controls. The enemy ships were fast, their movements unpredictable. They were getting closer, firing at the human ship with everything they had. Zor and Kiv had to stay focused, despite the fear trying to take over their minds. They had trained for this, but nothing had prepared them for the real thing. Zor fired again, and this time, the blast hit its target. The enemy ship exploded in a burst of flames and debris. For a moment, Zor felt a rush of relief, but the battle was far from over. "We're not done yet," Captain John shouted. "Stay sharp." The brothers continued to fire, each shot feeling more intense than the last. They didn't have time to think about their fears. They had to focus on the task at hand. The battle raged on, with both sides exchanging blasts of fire. The human ship took several hits, causing the entire ship to shake with each explosion. Zor and Kiv were pushed back in their seats as the ship rocked, but they didn't stop. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. Zor's mind was foggy, his body sore, but he pushed through. They were winning, but the cost was high. The enemy ships were relentless, but the human crew was determined. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last enemy ship was destroyed. The remaining ships retreated, and the battle was over. The control room fell silent. Zor and Kiv looked at each other, both breathing heavily. They were alive. They had made it through their first battle, but the reality of what they had just experienced sank in. The chaos, the destruction, the fear, it was all real. Captain John turned to them, his face still serious but with a small nod of approval. "You did well," he said. "You held your ground. You survived." Zor and Kiv were stunned. They had expected to be told they could have done better, that they needed to try harder. But instead, Captain John was acknowledging their efforts. They had proven themselves. As the brothers stood in the control room, staring out at the stars, they realized something important. They weren't the same brothers who had arrived on this ship. They had been tested, and they had survived. They weren't just orphans anymore. They were fighters. They were survivors. And they had the strength to face whatever came next. The days after the first battle were quiet, but not peaceful. Zor and Kiv had changed. They had fought in a real battle and survived. They weren't the same scared brothers who had first stepped onto the human ship, but there was still something they hadn't figured out, their relationship with Captain John. Before the battle, they had respected him because he was their leader. But now, after seeing him in action, something inside them had shifted. They were starting to see him in a new light. He wasn't just a harsh human who trained them. He was a warrior, a leader who had led them into battle without hesitation and had fought alongside them. One evening, after a long day of drills and training, Zor and Kiv sat in the common room of the ship. The place was quiet, with only the hum of the ship's engine filling the silence. Zor leaned back in his seat, his thoughts deep in his mind. "Kiv, do you ever wonder why Captain John does this? Why he pushes us so hard?" Kiv shrugged, still trying to shake the exhaustion of the day off. "I think he does it because he cares. He wants us to be ready. He wants us to survive out there." Zor nodded slowly. "Yeah, but he's not like other leaders. He's different. He doesn't show his emotions. But when we were in battle, I saw something in him. He wasn't just a captain. He was human. He cared about us more than we thought." Kiv's eyes widened. "You think so?" "I've always felt like he didn't care at all. He's so tough on us, like we're just another mission to him." Zor smiled, a small grin that barely reached his eyes. "I used to think that too. But now, I'm not so sure. I think he's trying to teach us something. He wants us to be strong, not just for the mission, but for ourselves." Kiv was quiet for a moment. He had never looked at Captain John that way before. But now, as he thought about it, he realized Zor was right. The captain wasn't just some cold, distant leader. He had put his life on the line for them. He had led them through their first battle, and he had trusted them to fight alongside him. That kind of trust was rare, and Kiv was beginning to understand just how much respect he owed Captain John. The next morning, the brothers were summoned to the command deck again. They had been training hard for days, but this time it felt different. They didn't know what to expect, but they were ready for whatever came next. Captain John stood at the front, looking over the crew. His expression was as stern as ever, But today there was something else in his eyes, something that Zor and Kiv couldn't quite place. Today, Captain John said, his voice steady, "We are going to conduct a final test. We've trained, we've fought, and now it's time to see if you're truly ready for what's ahead." Zor and Kiv stood straight, their minds focused. They didn't know what the test would be, but they had learned to trust Captain John's judgment. He wouldn't ask them to do anything they couldn't handle. The test turned out to be another battle. This time, however, it was different. The enemy was fierce, and the battle was long and intense. But as the hours passed, Zor and Kiv found themselves working together more smoothly than ever before. They trusted each other now, and they trusted Captain John too. Through the chaos, they noticed something. Captain John was always where he needed to be, always leading them, always giving them the right orders at the right time. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a leader in every sense of the word. And for the first time, Zor and Kiv realized that they weren't just following orders. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for each other. After the battle, as the ship drifted back to safety, the brothers gathered with the rest of the crew. They were tired, bruised, and worn out, but they had won. And for the first time, they felt like part of something important. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. They were learning. And most importantly, they were growing. Captain John stood before them, his eyes scanning the crew. "Good work," he said simply. "You've earned my respect. You've proven that you can survive. But more than that, you've proven that you're ready to be a part of this team." Zor and Kiv looked at each other, both of them stunned. For the first time, Captain John had spoken to them like equals. He had respected their efforts, their growth. It was the first time they had felt truly accepted. "Thank you, Captain," Zor said quietly. Kiv nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We won't let you down." Captain John gave them a small, approving nod. "I know you won't. You're not just soldiers. You're family now. And family looks out for each other." As the brothers left the command deck, they felt something inside them shift. The walls they had built around their hearts were starting to come down. They had found respect, not just for Captain John, but for themselves as well. They had learned that respect wasn't given. It was earned. And they had earned it through their hard work, their determination, and their willingness to fight for something bigger than themselves. The days after their victory in battle were peaceful, but Zor and Kiv couldn't stop thinking about Captain John. They had learned to respect him as a leader, but now something else was beginning to happen. They were starting to understand him in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about the training or the battles anymore. It was about who Captain John really was, as a person. For weeks, Captain John had been their harsh instructor, pushing them to be better. He had trained them, guided them, and even fought beside them. But there were moments when they saw something in him that confused them, something beyond the tough exterior. One day, after a long training session, Zor and Kiv found themselves in the ship's small kitchen, grabbing some food. They were exhausted, their bodies sore from the constant drills, but something felt different in the air. Captain John walked in, his usual serious expression on his face. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the brothers quietly. Zor and Kiv didn't know what to say. They had learned to stay silent around him, knowing that every word he spoke carried weight. But today was different. Today, Captain John seemed lost in thought. "You've been pushing us harder than ever," Zor said finally, breaking the silence. "Why?" Captain John turned toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no anger in them. Instead, there was a hint of sadness, something the brothers hadn't expected. "I push you because I know what it takes to survive," Captain John replied quietly. "When I was your age, I didn't have anyone to train me. I had to learn everything the hard way. I made mistakes, many of them. I don't want you to make the same ones." Zor and Kiv exchanged a quick glance. They hadn't expected that answer. They had always thought that Captain John pushed them so hard because he had no feelings. They had assumed he was cold, a warrior who cared about nothing but winning. But now, they were starting to see a different side of him. Kiv spoke up next, his voice softer than usual. "But why? Why are you so hard on us? You don't need to be." Captain John let out a deep sigh and leaned against the wall, his eyes looking far away. "Because I care. Because I know that the world out there is unforgiving. If you're not strong, if you don't know how to fight, you won't survive. And I've lost too many people to let that happen to you." Zor and Kiv didn't know what to say. They had always seen Captain John as someone who didn't show emotions, someone who didn't care about anything except the mission. But now, they were starting to realize that there was more to him than that. He was a man who had been through a lot, a man who had lost much, and he was doing everything in his power to make sure they didn't face the same pain. The room grew quiet, the only sound the hum of the ship's engine. Zor and Kiv stood there, processing Captain John's words. They didn't know what to say, but they felt a shift inside themselves. They had always seen him as a leader, but now they were seeing him as a person. "You've lost people?" Zor asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Captain John's eyes hardened, the pain of the past still fresh in his mind. "Yes, I've lost friends, family, people I cared about. That's why I push you. I don't want to lose anyone else." Kiv looked at him, his heart heavy with understanding. "You're not just training us to fight. You're training us to survive." Captain John nodded slowly, his eyes meeting theirs. "Exactly. I've seen too many people who weren't prepared for the reality of war. I've seen what happens to those who don't know how to survive. I won't let that happen to you." Zor and Kiv didn't speak for a long time. They had learned something important today, not just about Captain John, but about themselves. They had always been focused on surviving, on becoming strong enough to fight. But now, they understood why they had to be strong. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about keeping the people they cared about safe. It was about protecting their future. As the days went by, the brothers noticed changes in Captain John. He wasn't as harsh as he used to be. He still pushed them to be their best. But now, there was something different in his eyes. He was still a warrior, but he was also a teacher, a protector, and someone who cared for them in a way they hadn't realized before. One evening, after another long day of training, Zor and Kiv found themselves standing by the ship's observation window, looking out at the stars. They were deep in thought, reflecting on everything they had learned. "I think I understand him now," Zor said quietly. Kiv nodded. "Yeah, he's not just a soldier. He's someone who's been through a lot. He's trying to make sure we don't make the same mistakes." Zor smiled slightly. "I think he cares more than he lets on." Kiv smiled back. "Yeah, I think you're right." They stood there for a while, looking out at the endless expanse of stars. They had come a long way since their first days on the ship. They were no longer the scared brothers who didn't understand anything. They had learned to fight, to survive, and most importantly, they had learned that even in the toughest of humans, there was a heart that cared. And for the first time, Zor and Kiv felt like they truly understood the man who had trained them. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were part of something bigger. They were part of a family. The days turned into weeks, and life aboard the ship became routine for Zor and Kiv. They had trained hard, fought hard, and learned more than they ever thought possible. But the biggest lesson of all had come when they started to understand Captain John, not just as a leader, but as a person. They realized that the tough, unfeeling man they had first met wasn't the whole story. He was someone who had been through pain, loss, and heartache. He was someone who cared, even if he didn't always show it. One evening, after a long day of training, Zor and Kiv sat together in the ship's common area. The room was quiet, and the soft hum of the ship filled the space. They were tired, their bodies sore from the hard work, but there was something else in the air. A sense of calm, something they hadn't felt before. I can't believe how far we've come, Zor said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes on the ceiling. Kiv nodded in agreement, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Yeah. When we first got here, we didn't know what to expect. Now, I feel different, stronger, like we belong here. Zor smiled, his eyes thoughtful. We do belong here. Captain John made sure of that. It was true. Captain John had pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed. He had been tough on them, demanding their best every day. But he had also shown them something else, the importance of strength, not just physical, but emotional and mental as well. He had taught them what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. As the brothers sat in silence, the door to the common room opened, and Captain John walked in. He looked as serious as ever, but his eyes softened when he saw the brothers. "You two done with training for the day?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of something else, something warmer. Zor and Kiv stood up, instinctively saluting. But this time, it wasn't just out of habit. It was a sign of respect, a respect that had grown between them over the past few months. "Yeah, Captain," Kiv replied. "We're done for the day." Captain John nodded, walking over to the table where the brothers had been sitting. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, as if he had something important on his mind. "I've been thinking," Captain John said, looking directly at them. "You've both come a long way since we first met. You've earned my respect. But more than that, you've earned something else." Zor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that, Captain?" Captain John smiled. A rare sight. It was small, but it was there. "You've earned the right to call yourselves family." The words hit Zor and Kiv like a wave. Family. They had always been alone, drifting from place to place, never knowing what it meant to have a real family. But now, standing before Captain John, they realized something. They had found it. They had found family in each other, in Captain John, and in the people they had fought beside. "We're family?" Zor asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Captain John nodded, his gaze firm but warm. "Yes, you are. You've proven yourselves, not just as soldiers, but as people who care for each other. You're part of this crew. You're part of my family. And family looks out for each other." Kiv felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. He wasn't just an orphan anymore. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a family. "I don't know what to say," Kiv whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Zor put a hand on his brother's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You don't have to say anything. We're family. That's enough." Captain John looked at them both, his eyes filled with something they hadn't seen before, a softness, a care that wasn't there before. "You're right," Captain John said. "You don't have to say anything. But I'm proud of you both. You've come so far. And I'm glad to have you by my side. We've been through a lot together, and we'll face even more challenges ahead. But we'll face them as a family, together." The brothers nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in their hearts. They had been through so much already. They had fought battles, survived dangerous missions, and faced their fears. But through it all, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that they weren't alone anymore. They had found a family in each other, and that was something they would never lose. As the days went on, Zor, Kiv, and Captain John continued to fight side by side. They faced new challenges, new enemies, and new battles. But they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for each other. They were fighting for their family. And no matter what came next, they knew one thing for sure. Family would always come first. No matter how tough the battle, no matter how far the distance, they would always have each other. They were family forever.